In this video, I am going to explain anatomy of pelvic tilt muscles. There are two ways of pelvic tilt movements. First one is this, anterior tilt. The other way is posterior tilt. So anterior tilt is like you tuck in pelvis forward. Posterior tilt is obviously opposite. Tuck in pelvis like this way. So I'm gonna explain like a basic anterior tilt, posterior tilt movement. I'm not going to too much detail about every single detail of muscle. Alright, let me explain anterior tilt muscles. So basically, anterior tilt muscles are on anterior hip muscles. Where I'm gonna explain the other muscles, but first thing first. They are on anterior hip muscles, anterior thigh muscles, like this one. This is rectus femoris. Rectus femoris, this is part of quadriceps. Next one, this one. This is sartorius. The other one, this is tensor fasciae lata. They are on anterior hip, right? This is anterior side pelvis, rectus femoris, sartorius, tensor fasciae lata. They do anterior tilt. Same time, they are kind of a hip flexor muscles, anterior hip muscles. They do hip flexion, right? Basically, anterior hip muscles do anterior tilt of pelvis and hip flexion. And one more muscle I'd like to talk about is this one. This is iliacus. Well, this is deep muscle, but this muscle crosses anterior portion of hip. Look at that. They are on anterior muscles, right? Then there are kind of other characteristics for anterior tilt muscles. I was talking about anterior hip muscles, so anterior part of body, correct? Next muscle groups for anterior tilt muscles are back muscles. Imagine here, let's say erector spinae and multifidus. So I was talking about anterior hip muscles, then back muscles do anterior tilt. Imagine when anterior hip muscles contract, that brings hip for this direction. This is anterior tilt, right? So it's going like this circular kind of movement. What about when back muscles contract? That may bring pelvis this way, upward. This vector brings pelvis this way. What is this? What is this movement? This kind of vector movement. This is anterior tilt, don't you think? So, anterior hip muscles and back muscles do anterior tilt. Think about it. You can do it. When you try to contract back muscles, pelvis goes to anterior tilt. It's very important. So if you have somebody patient whose pelvis go to anterior tilt, too much anterior tilt, maybe you can palpate anterior thigh muscles, anterior hip muscles, and back muscles. Then you can determine which one is more tighter or both can be tight. So it's good to know. These are anterior tilt muscles. So let me explain posterior tilt muscles. Posterior tilt muscles are opposite from anterior tilt. I want to talk about two big muscle groups. First muscle group is this one. This is hamstrings. It's on backside. Very strong posterior tilt muscle. And the other muscle is this. This is gluteus maximus. These two muscle groups, were plus one muscle, right? Hamstrings and gluteus maximus, they are so strong muscles. Look at these thighs. Gluteus maximus, humongous. Hamstrings, humongous. Then let's go to profile picture. Imagine there are gluteus maximus and hamstrings like this. When these muscles contract, that brings pelvis this way. This is posterior way. Indeed, that would make posterior tilt. That's on posterior part, right? Anterior tilt, anterior hip muscles. Posterior tilt, posterior hip muscles. Simple. Then, what was I talking about for anterior tilt? Anterior tilt, anterior hip muscle, and back muscles. Yep, kind of a back side of trunk. Then, what kind of core muscles do posterior tilt? That's opposite. So, anterior core muscle, there is very famous one, correct? This is rectus abdominis. Imagine rectus abdominis runs like this. When your ab muscle contracts, that brings pelvis this way. Particularly, that brings pubis up. Pubis up. Then it's going this way. What is this? This is posterior tilt. So, simply, anterior thigh muscles, anterior hip muscles, and back muscles do anterior tilt. Posterior hip muscles and anterior core muscles do posterior tilt. So this kind of a diagonal relationship is very important to remember. So in today's video, I explained very simple muscle anatomy for anterior tilt and posterior tilt. If you liked today's video, please hit the like button, comment and subscribe. See you next video.